Good afternoon. All right, so curiously, the 1970s, which was a decade largely devoid of US human spaceflight, marked a significant era in space exploration. Now, this raises the question, what made the 1970s such a remarkable and transformative period in spaceflight? So during the 1970s, Americans were faced with a string of never-ending crises, including political scandals, inflation, gas lines, hostage crises, ongoing sexism and racism, nuclear reactor meltdowns, malaise, and the continuing Vietnam War. Many might argue that US spaceflight during the 1970s was sandwiched between two spectaculars, which would have been the Apollo lunar missions and the debut of the Space Shuttle, which happened in early 1981. However, during the 1970s, we saw a space station in orbit that later gave rise to the still evolving International Space Station. Also, it was the development of a space program that would define human spaceflight for the next several decades. It was a watershed time in planetary exploration, and there was a flowering of futurism. So the 1970s in space were defined by three currents: the human element, futurism, and the changing face of spaceflight. Now, to keep this talk informative but within acceptable time limits, I'm going to skip a lot. The paper that I submitted with this talk will provide a much more comprehensive breakdown of the 70s. Doing this talk, it was a huge challenge to fit 10 years and 20 to 25 minutes. But I hope I've achieved my goal at the end of this talk and that you're rooting for the 1970s by the end of it. I believe we need to approach this decade a little differently. To better illustrate in this period and illuminate the human factor, our guide will be astronaut Fred Haise, who experienced changes replete with adversity and triumphs during the decade from 1970 to 1979. So first I'm going to start. The decade in spaceflight began with a crisis that derailed the third lunar landing mission, Apollo-13. This is where Fred Haise enters the public's consciousness. Now, Haise has always been careful to emphasize the human collaborative effort that aided in bringing Apollo-13 safely home, which involved scores and scores of many different personnel, many who were not shown in the 1995 Ron Howard movie of the same name that many of you are familiar with. Haise has said, he said in a recent issue of Quest magazine, "I complained about that to Ron Howard, particularly about how some key people he didn't cover. Each mission really had 4 mission control teams, each with their own flight director." Now, the Apollo lunar missions that remained in the 1970s, the J-Science missions in particular, really provided a master class in how the human element impacted spaceflight. Michelle Hanlon mentioned earlier the Apollo-15 hammer and feather experiment. This was really an iconic demonstration of science for non-scientists. All sorts of people saw this demonstration and were like, wow. Apollo 15's Al Worden, the command module pilot, later published a poetry book post-flight. Now, this was probably anathema to the previous decade's archetypal, no-nonsense astronaut Frank Borman, who once said, "The last thing I would have wanted on our crew was a poet." Apollo 16 also provided some of the most colorful banter on the moon, provided by astronauts John Young and Charlie Duke. I'll just say 2 words: orange drink. Apollo 17's Ron Evans was probably also the most exuberant astronaut to perform an EVA ever, exclaiming "hot diggity dog" to thousands and thousands of viewers, and also he waved jubilantly to his family. Now, the human element also allowed Skylab, the first US space station, to survive despite severe launch injuries and to thrive throughout 3 successful missions that returned a scientific harvest. Television broadcast showed the 3 Skylab crews performing gymnastic feats within a massive orbital workshop that were really obviously impossible to carry out on Earth. And these views of the crews really just simply having fun in space further humanized spaceflight for generations. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about pop culture during that time. So early 1970s pop culture really began to pivot and reflect a more diverse society. For the first time, audiences flocked to theaters to watch the adventures of an unapologetically black detective, as we can see John Shaft. Music fans were still in awe of Elvis, but welcomed a new kind of rock star who was part space alien. Even in sports, there was a kind of newness. Willie Mays became known as one of baseball's most celebrated players, whereas 20 years earlier, Major League Baseball was nearly an all-exclusively white sport. Also, hockey's Gordie Howe became really the first Tom Brady, a celebrated older athlete. So in many ways, 1973 was a year of transitions and comebacks. As the public attention shifted from Skylab's exploits, a new issue unfortunately emerged. In October 1973, Ruth Bates Harris, NASA's Deputy Assistant Administrator for Equal Opportunity, was dismissed and publicly shamed. What was her crime? She requested a meeting with then Administrator James Fletcher to address the systemic lack of diversity within the agency. Now, despite regaining her employment eventually, the incident really served as a stark reminder of the deep-rooted diversity issues at NASA at that time. Now, meanwhile, while Skylab 3's crew experienced sunsets and sunrises every 90 minutes in Earth's orbit, Fred Haise was fighting for his life. On August 23, 1973, the 39-year-old Haise was involved in a crash of a Vultee-Vibrator BT-13 Valiant aircraft that resulted in him suffering from second and third degree burns over 65% of his body. After spending 2 weeks in intensive care being monitored for exposure to toxic gases, Haise spent 9 more weeks at the University of Texas Galveston hospital recovering from his injuries. While it took Fred Haise for over a year to be medically returned to flight, he did fully recover. So 1974, what a whopper of a year on many levels. Skylab's crewed missions ended in February and gave way to preparations for the final Apollo mission, which was the Apollo-Soyuz Test Project. Now, while the Space Shuttle had been approved in 1972, while future Space Shuttle commander John Young was walking on the moon, no less, it was really apparent that this new style space vehicle required technologies that really had yet to be designed, much less perfected. So while U.S. human spaceflight began to wind down mid-decade, July 1975's Apollo-Soyuz Test Project showed the power of the human touch and international collaboration within spaceflight. The American and Soviet crews even brought the show to Florida's Walt Disney World, which had opened for business in October 1971. And the crews are seen here. Let me get the laser pointer. There they are. The crews are seen photographed with astronaut Mickey Mouse at Magic Kingdom's Tomorrowland in front of the amusement park's hottest new ride. It just opened in January '75, the NASA-inspired Space Mountain. Its space-age vista and whopping 28 miles an hour of power captivated thousands of passengers, showing that space was really still fascinating to the public. And yeah, if you've ever screamed on this ride, just know that it's only going 28 miles an hour, so just a heads up. One futurist, a Princeton physicist by trade, who had been grappling with the question, is the surface of a planet really the right place for an expanding technological civilization since 1969, had a hopeful solution to Earth's problems. Let's go to space. Gerard K. O'Neill would join forces with other futurists of the time, including former NASA astronauts Philip Chapman and Brian O'Leary, to promote space settlements throughout the decade. NASA even got a futuristic, sleek new rebrand in 1975 with a logo that many of you popularly know as the worm. You can see this logo on tons of merchandise within the gift shops in this building. So, meanwhile, in Houston, Fred Haise was still recovering from the plane crash that nearly preempted his life as he prepared to fly Enterprise, the space shuttle that wouldn't make it to space. Now, Enterprise was unveiled with great ceremony, boasting Star Trek's original cast during the bicentennial year of 1976, and looked every inch the sleek aircraft/spaceship of the future, as you can see here. Also in 1976, Star Trek, and also related to Star Trek, actress Nichelle Nichols filled television screens, not as her character, Lieutenant Uhura, but as a flight-suited NASA recruiter with her rallying cry, "This is your NASA." For the first time, NASA actively searched for astronauts who better represented the nation they were going to represent in space, and a black female television icon was at the forefront of it. This was a far cry from the NASA who 3 years earlier had fired Ruth Bates Harris. The face of spaceflight, however, slowly was starting to change. Now, still clad in compression garments to aid his healing skin grafts, Fred Haise spent hundreds of hours alongside fellow astronaut Gordon Fullerton in Houston's, in this area, Orbiter Aeroflight Simulator, training to fly approach and landing tests, which were atmospheric tests that would show how the space shuttle and its computer software would handle lakebed and runway landings. By October 1977, he and Fullerton, along with astronauts Joe Engle and Richard Truly, made 5 flights in Enterprise, proving that the space shuttle at least was an airworthy bird. And in my personal opinion, the ALT program is criminally overlooked. All right, so by this point, we're starting to approach the end of the decade, so let's talk sports. Gordie Howe is in his 50s now, and is somehow still playing hockey for the Hartford Whalers. There he is in the upper left. It looks like he's hitting a teenager. It was a different time. Anyway, however, the era's new hockey superstar, Guy Lafleur, was on a collision course with disco that could not be stopped. His only disco album, which is seen up here, Lafleur, was released in 1979 to very little critical acclaim. So, in many ways, and I'm being serious here, in many ways 1979 was a year that really threatened to make 1974 look like a little golden book. Even entertainment suffered that year. Speaking of collisions, in 1979, NBC greenlit a television show with no actual plot, no real stars, and an atomic-powered train. Called Supertrain, it derailed after only 9 episodes, and to many represented how far network television had fallen during that decade. Fun fact, much of Supertrain's massive budget went to building a second model of the show's train because the first one crashed. So that should really tell you how awesome this show was. All right, so by decade's end, around the same time, Haise and Skylab 3 veteran Jack Lousma were announced to fly one of the first shuttle orbital missions, and their flight would have been audacious. It would have been the reboost of Skylab, which threatened to fall out of Earth's orbit by 1980. The mission profile would have seen Haise rendezvous the shuttle Columbia with Skylab, and Lousma would have remotely attached what was called a teleoperator retrieval system, which was sort of an inertial upper stage, or IUS, propulsion stage of the space station, and would have boosted that to a useful orbit. This graphic by Chris Spain shows what that mission may have looked like had it actually happened. However, it was not to be. The shuttle's development continued to crawl along, and by 1978, late 1978, it was clear that the Continued RS-25 engine failures and tile issues would make a shuttle flight before the end of that year just a non-starter. Also, Skylab's orbit was decaying much more quickly than expected. So this turn of events really left Hayes and Lausma without a mission. And it's a situation that Hayes in particular found disheartening. He would leave in 1979, leave NASA in 1979, a decision that was partly influenced by his disappointment over the canceled mission, and he would go to work for Grumman Aerospace. Meanwhile, spaceflight literature of that time was really at best out of touch with the program's actual versus hope capabilities. As a prime example, the 1978 Observer's Book of Manned Spaceflight by seasoned BBC journalist Reginald Turnill painted a picture of ambition, projecting a staggering 487 shuttle flights between 1980 and 1992 with a turnaround rate of 2 weeks. It's worth mentioning that these launches were planned to originate from Kennedy Space Center and Vandenberg Air Force Base from SLC 6, Space Launch Complex 6. So the reality was the shuttle was not fully built by 1979. In March 1979, Columbia, the first shuttle destined to make orbital space flights, was unveiled at NASA's Kennedy Space Center. Its big reveal did not go that well. The orbiter arrived atop, as you can see here, NASA's 747 carrier aircraft, missing much of its thermal protection system, or TPS, which is the lightweight grid of silica tiles meant to protect the shuttle from the scorching heat of reentry. And it would take over 2 more years to ensure that Columbia was spaceflight ready. These delays, along with Skylab re-entering over parts of Western Australia in July 1979, were cruelly contrasted in much of the press of the time with NASA's achievements 10 years earlier when Neil Armstrong took the first steps on the moon. In fact, I think there's, it's not up here, but there was a Time magazine cover of the time which had kind of a cruel, hey, this is NASA 10 years later kind of thing. So here's Skylab in February 1974, when last seen by its final crew. And here it is, re-entering Earth's atmosphere on July 11th, 1979. Okay, many of you by now probably think, I'm talking you out of the 1970s, but there were multiple high points by decade's end. The first group of NASA astronauts that genuinely represented the nation, featuring 6 women, 3 African Americans, and 1 Asian American, was unveiled in January 1978 and began to promote the idea that space was accessible to all people, not just one specific group. The European Space Agency also revealed their first 3 astronauts that year as well. So the decade by far did not end in failure. In fact, the 1970s was a watershed time for solar system exploration, encompassing planets Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. In 1979 alone, Voyagers 1 and 2 explored Jupiter, while Pioneer 11 flew by the ringed gas giant Saturn. And landers even touched during the decade upon Mars and Venus, although the Venus landers and probes, respectively by the Soviets and the US, obviously had a very short lifespan. So this artwork is from Pioneer Venus, which is one of my favorite interplanetary missions during the decade, and unfortunately I feel like it's largely forgotten. So you may wonder, where did it all end? The US eventually built on Skylab's success with Shuttle Mir and the still orbiting ISS. And if you really want to experience Skylab, there's a few feet from us at Space Center Houston if you want to see it today. There's also one in Huntsville, and there's also one that was supposed to actually fly at the National Air and Space Museum. So the Space Shuttle program, albeit flawed, defined U.S. human spaceflight for over 30 years, and its history is very much being written still. Over the lunch break, I picked up this book. This isn't an ad. I haven't read it yet, but this is Space Shuttle Stories. It just came out by astronaut Tom Jones, and it covers each mission. So really, people are still writing about it, and they're still analyzing it. Spaceflight better represents humanity, especially now with international partnerships. So if you really want to watch Supertrain, it's on YouTube. Watch it at your own risk. Gordie Howe finally retired in 1980. He'd been playing pro hockey since 1946. Space Mountain in Magic Kingdom and Disneyland are still running. I believe the one in Florida is the oldest U.S. indoor roller coaster, so if you really want to risk that, go ahead. NASA and private companies are readying for a return to the moon with the Artemis program, and the future that O'Neill, O'Leary, and Chapman predicted, which is a future of boundless possibilities in space exploration, is beginning to be realized with more players entering spaceflight and tech than ever, which for me ignites a sense of hope and excitement for what lies ahead. Now, what about Fred Hayes? Fred Hayes turned 90 in November 2023. He still remembers everything about his long career in aerospace and continues to speak to crowds, students, and museums. In 2022, he published his autobiography, the brilliantly titled Never Panic Early, written with space historian Bill Moore. And now what he calls his rocking chair years, he enjoys spending time with his beloved family and friends, and his intelligent, incisive presence in the space community over the years really genuinely demonstrates that the human element in spaceflight should not be overlooked. And that's all I have.